Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lord Gord Podcast. This is your host, Lord Gord. I'm giving you information that's factually correct and politically incorrect. And I've been watching you. I think I wanna know ya, but said I'm a little dangerous. Girl, I love to show ya, up my jungle love. Oh, oh. Think I wanna know ya, but. So this week is finally here. I've been telling you I was gonna do it for the last 2 weeks, but I called some audibles like I was Peyton Manning on the football field. And today I am covering the fascism of FDR. I read this great book, FDR's Folly, by Jim Powell. I found out about this book through some Thomas Sowell books. Thomas Sowell talks about some of the myths of the Great Depression, what caused the Great Depression. And also on Thomas Sowell's website, he has a recommended reading list, and FDR's Folly was on it. So I made sure to read it and to arm myself with information and knowledge so I can know how to refute these leftist hacks that lie and obfuscate and deny. Herman Cain said, let leftists have this strategy called sin. Shift the subject, ignore the evidence, and name call. So I'm going to be covering the fascism of FDR and just the horrible ideas and policies that he implemented and the consequences, not only to extend the Great Depression longer than it had to be, but the consequences today. All right, let's get into it. Fascism is often called a right-wing ideology, yet nothing could be further from the truth. It is a collectivist ideology that gives government the power to dictate how the rest of the population lives their lives. The fascists of Italy and of Nazi Germany were in favor of government control of wages and hours, onerous tax rates on the rich, government limits on profits, government care for the elderly, a decreased emphasis on the role of family and religion in the personal lives of people, and government taking on the role of changing the values and nature of the people. FDR followed every single one of the aforementioned policies of fascism with his New Deal policies. Such policies infringed on the rights of Americans and were antithetical to the constitutional ideal of limited government. His policies helped prolong the Great Depression by several years and started a trend of unconstitutional government spending and interference that continues to this day. So I'm just going to start by refuting some of the myths of the Great Depression. We're going to talk about where this whole idea of the government having to come in to fix the economy and what happened when people believed that the government shouldn't get involved. Here it is. Before the federal government believed that it was its duty to turn around the economy, recessions were handled by a reduction in government spending and an alteration of the behaviors of individuals in a free market. In 1921, there was a recession and the Harding administration faced an unemployment rate of 11.7%. Harding reduced government spending as revenues declined and unemployment fell to 6.7% in 1922 and 2.4% in 1923. In other words, Harding did not believe that it was his duty to interfere with the economy, to run the lives of other people, to tell business people how to run their business, even though you have no experience doing so. He just said, okay, we're receiving less revenue. Let's just cut back spending and let's let people make their own decisions. Voila, it worked. What a big surprise. Ronald Reagan faced a stock market crash in 1987 and let the economy recover on its own despite harsh criticism from the fake news media like New York Times, Washington Post, so on and so forth. The economy recovered on its own, and 20 years of steady growth and low inflation followed. There it is. The Great Depression wasn't caused by the stock market crash, as unemployment peaked at 9% 2 months after the 1929 crash and had fallen to 6.3% by June 1930. Okay? The Great Depression was largely caused by and extended by government intervention. The monetary contraction by the Federal Reserve, the SmootHawley Tariffs, unit banking laws that made many small banks vulnerable to failure, and the many New Deal policies that punished work, savings, and investment helped create and extend the Great Depression. Though many schemes were tried, unemployment rose to double digits by the end of 1930 and didn't fall below double digits for the rest of the decade. And I won't really touch on it on this podcast, but with the banks failing, 90% of the banks that failed were unit banks. They were small banks in small towns and were forbidden to have branches, so that if they're in an area where wheat's their primary source of revenue, if the wheat people aren't making money, they're basically done. I was reading in the book that in Canada, during the same period, most of their banks were branches, so they were able to diversify their portfolio, and virtually none of their banks failed. So it was a lie that the bank failures were caused by capitalism or something like that. No, it was government. It was the government limiting what certain banks can do, and because they were limited in what they could do, they failed because they had all their eggs in one basket. All right, so let's talk about the SmootHawley Tariff. President Herbert Hoover signed the SmootHawley Tariff on June 17th, 1930. Remember, unemployment was only at 6.3% at this time. It raised import tariffs by an average of 59% on more than 25,000 different goods. The stock market plunged, and over 60 different countries retaliated with tariffs of their own. Spain, for example, increased tariffs on American cars by 150%. Italy more than doubled its tariffs on American cars, and sales of American cars dropped in Italy by 900%. By 90%, I'm sorry. The farmers that lobbied for the tariff were hit hard as their revenues declined from $1.8 billion before the tariff to $590 million 4 years later. And this is one of the things I don't like about Trump, is that, his tariffs are going to benefit a very small amount of people, and they're going to hurt a majority of people. Harley Davidson, for example, because of the tariffs on steel, said that they can't make motorcycles in America anymore. It's too expensive. The SmootHawley Tariff was an absolute disaster. Economists, hundreds of them, took out an advertisement in the paper saying, "Do not do this. The economic consequences will be disastrous." The politicians didn't listen, and the economic consequences were disastrous. And also, President Bush had tried some tariffs on steel, and while it benefited a small amount of people, steel workers in the United States, it hurt the consumer because the consumer had to pay more for steel products, and it hurt businesses that relied on steel because they had to pay more money for steel. So usually tariffs and restrictions on trade, they benefit a very small amount of people that are very organized, and they hurt an even larger group of people that aren't nearly as organized as the small group that benefits. So that's why you rarely hear about the negative consequences of tariffs and trade wars, but you'll hear about, the couple companies that are benefiting from it, all at the expense of other people. That's why I don't like government. All right, so let's talk about price controls by FDR. FDR's National Recovery Administration was signed into law on June 16th, 1933. It gave labor unions monopoly bargaining power and empowered them to force employers to pay wages above the market rate. I mean, you had things passed at this time like Davis-Bacon Act, Fair Labor Standards Act, so on and so forth, these minimum wage laws, these laws that force people to pay the union rate, so on and so forth. And what strikes me about these New Dealers, some were very ardent socialists, what strikes me about them is they say they hate monopolies. No, they don't hate monopolies. They hate private industry. They hate private monopolies because they're monopolizing workers, right? They're monopolizing government to run the lives of other people. So it's not control that they're not fans of. It's that they don't like individuals making their own decisions for themselves. They are every bit a fan of monopolies and collectivism. Probably even more so than a businessman, but they are very dishonest in the way that they share their sentiments. Okay, so because the FDR administration played favorites for labor unions, I mean, I won't go into too much details, but these guys were active socialists and communists. They were just destroying people's property and factories. They were locking owners out. Just thuggery. And some of the worst parts about it were that these people were so ungrateful. They had jobs, but they wanted to get paid so far above the market rate that a lot of people lost their jobs. For example, blacks, about 500,000 blacks lost their jobs because of the NRA minimum wage law. I've talked about prices and economic freedom many and many times before, how price floors like minimum wages create a surplus. So literally the white labor union said, hey, pay us this. And because the companies, through government, were forced to pay a certain wage, everyone who couldn't meet those standards were priced out of a job. I mean, even in this book, one of the Supreme Court justices, I forget his name, but he was against a minimum wage law for women because he saw that, hey, if these women have to get paid the same amount as a man, no one's going to hire the woman because the woman's a less preferred worker. She's not as strong. She doesn't work as much, so on and so forth. So blacks really suffered under FDR. So these laws also ushered in the 40-hour work week, further limiting the freedoms of workers and employers. I was watching a podcast with Peter Schiff and Joe Rogan, and Peter Schiff brilliantly explained how overtime laws hurt workers. Because on the surface it sounds good. Hey, if you work me a certain amount of hours, you're gonna have to pay me time and a half. But then, what that does is that makes keeping your guys a little longer more expensive, so you're less likely to keep those guys over. You might hire someone else, or you might not do the work entirely. Because if the work's only worth $15 an hour, and now after 8 hours I have to pay him a time and a half, I'm losing money there. So the work just doesn't get done, and it really limits just what employees and employers can make agreements on. Listen, if I could work 10 hours and not make overtime, yeah, I'd do that, because of the overtime law, I won't be able to work those 10 hours. So the question always is, compared to what and at what cost, right? Let's talk about the NRA a little bit more. The NRA was also able to control the output of companies, how much they had to pay employees, and what employees could sell their goods for, or what employers could sell their goods for, and employees, because you sell your labor. So minimum wage law says you are forced to sell your labor at a certain price. Unions say you are forced to sell your labor at a certain price. So they are forcing employers and employees to sell their goods at a price above free market. Many businesses turned against the NRA because the policies forced them to sell goods for higher prices with no discernible advantage. So their goods weren't being sold, they were losing money. The NRA was struck down as unconstitutional on May 29th, 1935. Raymond Moley, one of the framers of the NRA, said, quote, "Economic planning on a national scale in a politically free society involve contradictions that cannot be resolved in practice," close quote. Translation: in a free society, in a society that's founded on limited government, individual freedom, individual responsibility, economic planning, central planning does not work. That is the stuff of communists and socialists and fascists, which FDR was. That's what they do in Latin America. And I've talked about Latin America and why it lags so badly compared to places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, so on and so forth. Let's keep it going. Farmers and the federal government destroyed food in order to keep prices artificially high. So they had all these antitrust lawsuits against these companies saying that companies are fixing prices, so on and so forth, when literally the government was forcing employers and employees to fix their prices. It was forcing farmers to destroy their food so they can keep their prices high. The government was doing all the things that they were accusing other people of doing. Okay? So they were destroying food. I mean, they were slaughtering pigs, so on and so forth. People are hungry in the streets, yet they are destroying food to keep prices high because they understand, hey, when the supply is high, the price is going to go down. When the supply is low and the demand is high, the price are going to go up. So they knew what they were doing. They were insidious. Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act on May 12, 1933. It imposed a production tax on food processors and rewarded those that followed the edicts of government to reduce output of items such as tobacco and hogs. FDR presented the act as a temporary measure but envisioned it being permanent because these new dealers did not care about the outcomes of their actions. What they cared about was, dismantling America and remaking a new America in their fascist, leftist goal. They hated individualism. They hated the free market. They hated private property rights. So they wanted to run the world as they saw fit because they believed that they were smarter than everyone else. And this is really when communism and socialism were in vogue. I mean, these guys look up to people. They looked up to people like Mussolini. W.E.B. Du Bois had looked up to Adolf Hitler at one point because they are leftists. They are big government totalitarians. They think that they're so smart that they can run the lives of other people, that they can remake humanity in the image that's in their mind. But it never works. And also, I forget some of the details, but the government was essentially paying people to like not use their farmland, and if they make more crops than they can sell, the government will buy it back. So it was just so much waste. The government was dumping grain and wheat in Europe, so on and so forth. Kind of like how the Chinese dump steel here because the Chinese taxpayer subsidizes steel, which hurts our steel companies. I mean, serves our steel companies, but benefits our car manufacturers and benefits us as consumers because we get cheaper steel, all at the expense of the Chinese. But yeah, it was an absolute disaster. This is what happens time and time again. I explained in Prices and Economic Freedom, one of my previous podcasts, why price ceilings like rent control and government health care and price floors like minimum wage, they create disasters every time they're implemented. So let's talk about FDR's anti-growth tax plan. FDR increased the highest tax rate to 75% from Hoover's 63%. In 1936, FDR signed into law a tax plan that punished companies for saving money for investments. Companies that retained 1% of its net income would have 10% of it taxed away. These tax hikes drew far less revenue than predicted, and they discouraged productive economic behavior. Lamont DuPont said in a Senate hearing, quote, "If an investment proves successful, most of the profit goes to the government. If unsuccessful, the individual bears all the loss," close quote. So in other words, business people face all the consequences, but none of the reward. So when you increase the cost of something, you're going to get less consumption. When you reduce the cost of something, you're going to get more of something. So by increasing the cost of being a productive businessman, or even going into business in general, you got less people going into business, less investment, less jobs. The best creator of jobs and prosperity is the private sector. If that wasn't the case, then Soviet Union and Maoist China and Cuba would be economic powerhouses, but they're not. Okay, private investment fell by $3.1 billion in the 1930s, and the anti-business climate scared off investors. Of course it did. If you know that you're not going to make any money back, you face all the risk but none of the reward, why do it? Social Security, which is a Ponzi scheme designed to create government dependence for votes, also discouraged unemployment. The payroll tax led to higher prices for the consumer, which was a negative for employment. Employers were required to display this notice. Quote, "Beginning January 1st, 1937, your employer will be compelled by law to deduct a certain amount from your wages every payday." This is in compliance with the terms of the Social Security Act signed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt August 14, 1935. The deduction begins with 1% and increases until it reaches 3%. To the amount taken from your wages, your employer is required to pay, in addition, either an equal or double amount. The combined taxes may total 9% of the whole payroll. This is not a voluntary plan. Close quote. So in the book, it explains further that a lot of politicians, even some Democrats, oppose Social Security because of the abject consequences and the fact that the government would be able to extort people and have a vast control of resources. And some people, they propose something saying, okay, if you want Social Security, we should have a private option and we should allow people the freedom to choose which plan they want to go into. What did the New Dealers say to that? God, no. They said no choice, because they knew that the Social Security plan was garbage and they wanted to force everyone into that garbage. So they were bitterly opposed to any kind of competition for Social Security. So the Social Security tax alone took $2 billion out of the economy. Due to all the taxes, industrial production fell by a third, 20% of workers lost their jobs, 10 million people were out of work, and unemployment was near 20%. So let me read some quotes from Social Security from the book. James Emery of the National Association of Manufacturers added, "If you increase the cost of employment and men, the tendency is to employ a machine which would be less expensive and which would not subject you immediately to the tax. It would be a tendency in industries where the labor cost is high." Emery pointed out that the Social Security payroll tax, like other business expenses, would be passed on to consumers, and the resulting high prices would be a negative for employment. General recovery depends on our ability to enlarge our production, to employ more people, and to cut down and not raise up the price of goods. Every time we increase the price of goods in a diminishing market, we are diminishing the possibility of employing other men, because we are making it more difficult, not less, to sell goods. Until we can market goods, we cannot employ more men, close quote. And here's that brilliant fascist FDR. Asked about the likelihood that Social Security payroll taxes would help prolong high unemployment by making it more expensive for employers to hire people, FDR admitted, quote, "I guess you're right on the economics, but those taxes were never a problem of economics. They were politics all the way through," close quote. I'll let you chew on that. Let's talk about FDR's gold appropriation. The Emergency Banking Act, signed March 9, 1933, amended the Federal Reserve Act by adding a new subsection that empowered the Secretary of the Treasury to demand that Americans surrender their gold and receive paper money at the point of a gun. The next day, FDR issued Executive Order 6073, which prohibited the removal of gold from the United States. Sounds very Latin American to me. On April 5th, 1933, FDR issued Executive Order 6012, which appropriated private gold. Appropriated is just a nice way of saying stole. You know, like when they say we're going to nationalize oil, that means they are going to put a gun to people's head and steal their business and give it to the government. That's what appropriate means, to steal. Violators would receive a $10,000 fine or up to 10 years in jail if they didn't forfeit their gold to the government by May 1st, 1933. They put a gun to their head and say, if you don't give up your gold, we're going to fine you out of oblivion or you're going to jail. Socialism, communism, fascism is always at the barrel of a gun. Remember that. FDR had wanted to take away gold from his citizens so badly, he just wanted it so bad, that he forgot to declare a state of emergency before seizing the gold. So on August 12, 1933, he rescinded his executive order of April 5th. The executive order declared a state of emergency and then reissued the edicts on gold. So essentially he said, hey, the government can say state of emergency and then do whatever it wants. That is very dictatorial. This man FDR implemented more executive orders than all following presidents combined. It's very Latin American. It's very fascist. All right? Very Nazi-like. The next day, FDR issued Executive Order 6261, which required all U.S. gold producers to sell their output to the Treasury at prices set by the Treasury. So the Treasury can say, hey, we're going to buy back your gold at $1 a pound, even if your gold's worth $100, because we say so. And if you don't do it, we will throw you in jail, or we will fine you out of oblivion. If you don't want to be dragged in jail, we'll kill you. Isn't big government so great? FDR's thoughts were that gold buying would push up the prices for farm commodities, but soon changed his tune to stabilizing the value of the dollar, because he soon realized that buying up all the gold didn't change the didn't affect prices of farm commodities at all. So then he said, hey, oh yeah, I'm buying up all this gold to stabilize the dollar. Utter nonsense. It was just to increase his power over people. Okay, that's it. It's nonsense. All right, let's talk about FDR's vote buying. According to the U.S. National Resources Planning Board, between 1933 and 1939, 42.6% of federal relief and public works expenditures were paid for by tax increases, and 57.4% were paid for by borrowing money, which had to be paid for in future taxes, by the way. The Civilians Conservation Corps, a government jobs program, cost over $2 billion between 1933 and 1939, and a majority of the money went to Western states. Why, you might ask? Well, the reason was that Southern states were heavily Democratic, and FDR wanted the Western vote for the 1936 election. So he knew that he had those guys in the bag, so why would he spend a bulk of the money on people who already like him? He spent the money on people who are on the fence about him. You know? The top 14 states in terms of federal aid were all Western states, and a Westerner on average received 60% more in New Deal money than his Southern counterpart. So as we see here, all this stuff, all this big government intervention, all this unconstitutional power that the executive branch was using, all this price fixing, all this centralized power, it wasn't to help the American people. It didn't help the American people at all. It made the situation much worse. What it was to prove that this small concentrated elite was so much smarter than everyone else so that they can run their lives. It was to acquire power, okay? And a lot of the bad ideas about this, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all this big government entitlement, a lot of it stems from the Great Depression here. I mean, Social Security is going bankrupt. I think, let me see, in the book, it says, it's a pyramid scheme because essentially in Social Security, there is no private account. Like, I can't go to the federal government and say, okay, how much is in my account right now? And how much can I take out? No, it's compelled. It's literally, I'm right now paying for old people who are receiving Social Security. If you know about wealth and income, the wealthiest age group on average in the United States is age 65 and older. So us poor people are being stolen from to give to people who have things. It's truly insidious. Let me see here. I'm trying to find the quote on this, how many, when Social Security started, there was a certain amount of taxpayers per beneficiary, and that is shrunken over time. And unless we either get rid of Social Security, which I would be in favor of because it's unconstitutional, or we reduce benefits substantially, it's going to go bankrupt. Let's see. Why can't I find it? Okay, here it is. All right. Back in 1945, at the beginning of the baby boom, 42 taxpayers supported each Social Security recipient. Now there are only about 3 taxpayers supporting each Social Security recipient. By the year 2030, as people born in 2000 approach their peak earning years, there will be only 1.5 taxpayers supporting each Social Security recipient, which means taxes will skyrocket or benefits will be cut, or both. Or people will understand that it's completely immoral to steal from one person and give it to someone who doesn't belong, and will say, hey, this scheme has not worked. It was a failure. It was designed to create voting blocks, to create government dependency, and we should get rid of it. I doubt this is going to happen. But it should. And FDR's folly is followed today with Keynesians and these big government totalitarians that think that you can tax and spend your way to prosperity. For example, Winston Churchill said, a nation trying to tax and spend its way to prosperity is like jumping in a bucket and trying to lift yourself by the handle. It doesn't work. Barack Obama, someone I don't like, he tried this whole thing with the stimulus package and all these jobs programs, and the economy didn't recover. It was garbage. It was horrible. And if he would study history, he would know that, centralized power and high taxes and redistribution schemes or distribution schemes, because money isn't distributed, it's earned. Those inhibit employment. When you raise the price of employment with things like Obamacare, so on and so forth, you're going to reduce employment. I mean, this happened in France and other parts of Western Europe. So there are people that still believe this garbage, that FDR got us out of the Depression, and it's not true. That's the Lord Gord Podcast. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe on iTunes. Subscribe on YouTube. Share it with a friend. Leave a comment. Leave a review. Donate on Patreon. Get the Lord Gord Funk album, This Isn't TV, on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, YouTube, so on and so forth. If you're in LA, come to the Blues Jam every Tuesday night at the Airliner in Lincoln Heights from 9 p.m. to midnight. It's 21 and over, free admission, dollar tacos, and it's open mic, so if you can play an instrument or sing, you can come up and enjoy it. Next week, I'll be covering one of my favorite video games of all time, Earthbound, just the history of it, my history with it, why I liked it. So I'm going to be taking it a little easy, and it's going to be a good time. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you next time.